I was painting their porch when she appeared, and suddenly the air felt heavier, charged, like it knew something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. She leaned casually against the doorframe, one hand resting on the polished wood, the other idly tucked into the pocket of her linen trousers. Graceful, poised, the kind of presence that seemed to command a room without demanding it. Her hair caught the sunlight in streaks of gold, and I found myself momentarily mesmerized by the way her eyes, calm, knowing, a little amused, watched me as I brushed white paint along the railing. "Careful there," she said softly, the words playful, yet layered. I didn't need to look up to feel the warmth of her gaze tracing my shoulder, lingering, noticing. I wiped a bead of sweat from my temple, trying not to stare, trying not to betray how aware I was of every subtle movement she made. She shifted slightly, and our hands brushed, brief, accidental, but the contact sent an unfamiliar jolt up my arm. I froze, caught in that fraction of a second where the world seemed to shrink to the space between us. "Are you sure that's straight?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice lighter now, teasing, as if she had all the time in the world and was enjoying watching me squirm just a little. Her perfume, something soft, a faint mix of jasmine and something warmer, earthier, drifted around me. I tried to focus on the brush, on the angle, on the lines, but my attention kept snapping back to her. Her fingers hovered near the railing, brushing mine again when she leaned over to inspect my work. That brief touch was enough to make my pulse stumble. My hands felt clumsy, and yet I couldn't pull away from the quiet intimacy of the moment. Her presence was close, yet not intrusive, like standing near sunlight that warmed without burning. I finally dared to glance at her properly. She caught me looking, and her lips curved in that subtle, knowing smile, half mischievous, half inviting. My chest tightened without warning. I wanted to speak, to say something witty, something that might capture even a fraction of what I was feeling, but the words lodged in my throat. She noticed. She always noticed. The breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of fresh paint and warm wood, but it did nothing to distract me from her nearness. Every subtle motion, how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way her shoulders eased into a casual stance, was magnified. I could feel the quiet tension humming between us, fragile, delicate, unspoken, like electricity waiting for permission. Then, just as I dared to reach for another brushstroke, her voice broke through again, lower this time, softer. "You're missing what I really want." I froze mid-motion, my heart knocking against my ribs, because even in her teasing, there was something else, a subtle weight behind the words that I couldn't parse, something that made the air between us suddenly impossibly taut. Before I could answer, the screen door creaked open, cutting through the silence, and I realized we weren't alone anymore. I put the brush down, pretending to check the paint can, but my eyes kept finding her. She was standing near the doorway, casually straightening the hem of her blouse, but the way she shifted her weight, the way her fingers lingered on the fabric, made my chest tighten without warning. There was a confidence about her, yes, but also a hint of hesitation, a fragility that made her even more magnetic. I'd seen her like this before, though never like this. She moved through the world with a practiced grace, smiles offered carefully, laughter measured. People saw confidence. I saw the quiet spaces behind it, the loneliness she carried when no one was looking, the way she sometimes tucked herself into corners, like the world might break her if it looked too closely. And I knew that look, because I carried my own, a kind of restless, unspoken yearning that people rarely noticed. "You've been quiet," she said, stepping closer, her voice soft enough that I could feel her breath on my ear. I tried to answer, tried to make it casual, but my throat went dry. She didn't wait for my words. Instead, she brushed her hand across my shoulder, not harshly, not lightly, but just enough to make me shiver. Her touch lingered longer than it needed to, and I caught myself wishing it would stay even longer. It was complicated. I was 20, barely out of college, still figuring out how to navigate the world. She was in her mid-40s, articulate, self-contained, and far too perceptive for comfort. There were whispers of the age difference, silent judgments I imagined in every glance from neighbors or family. Yet here, on this quiet porch, those worries melted into the background, leaving only the taut, dangerous electricity that crackled between us. She leaned slightly over the railing, inspecting a smudge of paint I hadn't noticed. Her hair brushed my arm as she reached across me. I wanted to pull back, to remind myself that this was absurd, but my body betrayed my thoughts, leaning in just a fraction, wanting her closer. And she noticed. I could feel her sensing it, sensing me. She pulled back just a little, eyes flicking to mine, teasing, but in that teasing, there was an invitation I couldn't ignore. I thought about the past she never mentioned, the quiet way she carried herself, the small sighs she hid when she thought no one was listening. And I thought about my own, how I'd left relationships that didn't leave me breathless, how I had spent too long watching from the sidelines, afraid of making a mistake. With her, everything felt sharp, immediate, alive. "Careful," she said again, her hand brushing mine as she adjusted a corner of the porch. My pulse spiked. The contact was fleeting, but the electricity it left behind lingered, humming through my veins. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't going away quietly. For a moment, we just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking. Her fingers lingered against mine a fraction longer than needed, and for once, I didn't pull away. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in soft gold, and the air between us seemed to thrum with a quiet promise, unspoken but undeniable. The porch felt smaller that evening, as if the air itself had tightened around us. I was crouched, painting the base of a post, when I sensed her standing just behind me, her presence so close I could feel the warmth radiating off her. Every movement I made seemed amplified, every brushstroke deliberate. My pulse thumped like a drum in my ears. She leaned over, inspecting the line I'd just painted. Her hand brushed mine. Not casual, not accidental, though we pretended it was. And for a second, I imagined pressing closer, imagining the brush slipping from my fingers. She caught my eyes, holding them a beat too long, and I saw a flash of mischief, fear, something unspoken flicker across her face. Then the moment fractured. A phone buzzed sharply on the counter inside, jolting us both. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure as she stepped back, her fingers lingering in the space they had just occupied. The intrusion was minor, yet it felt like the world had reminded us we weren't supposed to be here, weren't supposed to feel this. "Did you want me to check that?" I asked, voice quieter than intended, catching the flicker of tension in her eyes. She shook her head, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and her shoulder brushed mine again as she leaned over to reach for a rag. The contact sent a ripple through me, and I could feel my chest tightening. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. We exchanged glances, short beats of acknowledgement and restraint. Every subtle movement, the way her eyes flicked to my lips, the way my hand lingered over the railing, spoke louder than we could admit. My mind raced, imagining what would happen if we didn't pull back, if we let that spark ignite. Guilt surged almost as fast as desire. "I should probably finish that side," I muttered, trying to sound casual. My voice faltered when she stepped closer, her hand brushing mine as she handed me the brush. Our fingers touched briefly, and for a heartbeat, everything else dissolved. The paint, the porch, the quiet buzz of the evening, leaving only the tension between us. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, almost daring me, and I wanted to close the distance, wanted to see if the warmth I felt was mirrored in her. But restraint was there, stubborn and heavy, like a third presence in the porch air. Fear whispered in the corners. What if someone saw? What if we were wrong? What if desire itself was a mistake? Yet we didn't move apart. We hovered closer than we should, her shoulder brushing mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. It was impossible to ignore the pull, the almost there closeness that made my hands tremble and my chest ache. A long pause stretched between us, full of unspoken admissions, before we both finally exhaled, but not enough to break the tension. In that moment, she shifted slightly, leaning just a fraction nearer. I could feel it, The pull of gravity between us, silent but insistent. We were closer than ever, yet both still tethered by hesitation, held back by the rules we hadn't agreed to break. And for the first time, I realized that restraint was no longer the only thing keeping us apart. The air felt impossibly thick that evening, charged with something neither of us could name, but both of us recognized. I had been painting in silence, my movements deliberate, yet every brushstroke felt like it drew me closer to her, to the edge of a boundary I didn't know I was ready to cross. She stepped closer than usual, her presence pressing against me in ways that made my chest tighten. Her hair brushed my shoulder, a whisper of warmth and scent. Jasmine, sunlight, something uniquely her, and I couldn't move. My fingers itched to reach for her, to tuck that stray strand behind her ear, to see if she would lean into it. I shouldn't, she whispered, a tremor in her voice that betrayed a conflict between desire and restraint. Her eyes locked on mine, wide, searching, daring me. I wanted to tell her that I had been thinking of this moment, that I had imagined her smile, her laugh, the heat of her hand against mine. But the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I let my hand move of its own accord, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my fingers grazing her cheek. She shivered slightly, and the quiet gasp she didn't try to hide cut sharper than any sound I'd heard all day. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. It was reckless, loud, exposed. "Do you want me to stop?" I asked, my voice low, almost breaking. Her gaze faltered for the briefest second, then she leaned imperceptibly closer, just enough to make me question if restraint had ever existed. The tension between us became a tangible thing, a coil of longing, hesitation, and unspoken promises. A sudden laugh from inside the house startled us both, and she stepped back, hand lingering where mine had just brushed hers. Her eyes, dark and serious now, held mine as if challenging me to speak, to act, to admit what we both already knew. And yet, fear hovered. Fear of judgment, of scandal, of the world outside this porch that wouldn't understand. I can't stop thinking. I confessed finally, words almost too quiet, too vulnerable. My hands hovered near hers, unsure whether to reach or retreat. She tilted her head slightly, lips parted, and the air between us seemed to hum with electricity. I could feel her breath, warm and steady, brushing my ear, and it was enough to make my knees feel weak. Her hand found my arm, a light but deliberate touch that grounded me even as it pulled me closer. Every micro-movement, the twitch of her lips, the slight tilt of her chin, the brush of her hair across her collarbone, made my mind fracture between reason and desire. Then she leaned even closer, and for a fleeting second, nothing else existed. Our faces were inches apart, breaths mingling, hearts racing, and the world seemed to hold its breath with us. "I don't know if I should," she murmured, but she didn't move away. And that's when the porch light flickered, plunging us into shadow for a heartbeat, right before the unspoken, inevitable moment threatened to cross the final line. I hadn't expected her to laugh. Light, almost airy, but it came out sharp, a sound that made my chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with amusement. She stepped closer, brushing past me in the narrow space of the porch, and I could feel the heat of her body, close enough to burn, close enough that my hands itched to linger. "I wasn't honest with you," she admitted suddenly, voice low, almost swallowed by the evening air. My brush paused mid-stroke, and I felt my pulse spike. She shifted, the hem of her sleeve brushing my wrist as if unintentionally, and I nearly lost my balance. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously, my heart hammering. Her eyes held mine, dark, serious, and just a little vulnerable, like she was daring me to step closer, daring me to see what she was afraid to say. I know what you feel," she whispered, leaning so near that her hair brushed the side of my face. My breath caught. "And she faltered, biting her lip, a subtle gesture that sent a jolt through me. I felt it too, longer than I wanted to admit. I froze. The world seemed to shrink to that one admission, one line that neither confirmed nor denied everything I had hoped for. My hands shook slightly, caught between impulse and restraint, between the desire to close the distance and the fear of what it would mean if we crossed that line. You're saying you noticed? My voice sounded brittle even to me. She nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that made my chest tighten again. Her shoulder brushed mine as she leaned back slightly, but not far enough, and I realized how fragile the balance had become, how much electricity we'd been holding back. I wasn't sure it was right, she said, glancing away for a fraction of a second, then back. That split second of hesitation made me ache in ways I hadn't known were possible. Her fingers brushed mine as she reached to steady the paint, and I'd nearly dropped, a touch so fleeting it almost seemed imagined, but my body remembered every inch of it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was heavy, thick with desire, guilt, and the knowledge that our restraint was slipping. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. I wanted to speak, to reassure her, to confess that I had been drawn to her from the first glance, from the first brush of her hand, but words failed me. You don't have to decide anything tonight, she said softly, but her hand lingered just a moment too long on mine. But you should know, the choice isn't as simple as it seems. Her admission left a taste in the air, sharp and sweet all at once. Every instinct in me was screaming forward, yet the world outside that porch, expectations, age difference, consequences, pushed back. And in that push and pull, the attraction between us grew almost unbearable, a live wire of longing and fear that neither of us could ignore. I realized then that the next moment would matter, whether it was a step closer, a touch, or the smallest confession. And for the first time, I understood that there was no going back from what we had uncovered tonight. She leaned just a fraction nearer, and I felt it. The invisible pull, the impossible weight of the space between us, tightening, bending toward the inevitable. The porch seemed to shrink around us, the evening air sticky with heat, paint fumes, and the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. I could feel her breath brush against my cheek, hear it hitch in the softest of whispers as we leaned closer, our bodies just shy of contact. Every instinct screamed forward, and yet reason lingered at the edges, hesitant, warning. I can't keep pretending, I murmured, my voice low, barely carrying over the faint rustle of leaves. She blinked, letting the words settle between us. Her hand found mine, lingering deliberately, and I felt a tremor run through both of us. I know, she said softly, her lips near enough that I could feel the warmth of her exhale. Her eyes searched mine, open, unflinching, and I realized there was no denial here, no hesitation beyond the one we were about to overcome. Time slowed. The brush of her hand against mine was deliberate now, intentional, and the space between our bodies seemed impossible to measure. Every heartbeat, every quiet inhale, stretched longer than it should. I wanted to speak, to name what we both felt, but words would only dilute it. So I stayed still, letting the electricity pass through us, connecting us without noise. You understand, she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. The vulnerability in her tone was raw, unguarded, and it pulled something loose inside me I hadn't known I was holding back. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, letting my hand tighten subtly around hers. We didn't move forward yet, but the restraint was no longer out of choice. Our closeness was a taut wire, a live current that neither of us could ignore. Every glance, every subtle brush, every inch that separated us hummed with the weight of everything unsaid, desire, longing, fear, and hope. I've waited too long, I admitted finally, voice hoarse, low enough that only she could hear. I can't not do this. Her eyes softened, half-shadowed by the dim porch light, and she leaned just enough to close the last fraction of distance. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't planned, it wasn't clean, but it was real. My hand brushed her hair from her face, fingertips grazing her skin in a touch that left both of us shivering, suspended between surrender and hesitation. I could feel her pulse, the warmth radiating from her, the silent acknowledgement of every moment that had led to this. For the first time, everything made sense. The fear, the longing, the forbidden weight of what we felt. It was all a part of the truth we'd been skirting around. And now, standing there, so impossibly close, we understood each other fully, without pretense or hesitation. We didn't kiss yet. We didn't need to. The promise in the space between us, the surrender to the tension, was enough. The world outside the porch might judge, might frown, might never understand, but for the first time, it didn't matter. Because here, now, we had each other. And that was enough. The morning sun filtered through the slats of the porch, soft and forgiving, painting everything in a golden glow that made the edges of reality feel softer, almost tender. We sat side by side on the worn wooden railing, hands brushing, fingers entwining as naturally as breathing. No words were necessary. Everything had been said in the nights of stolen glances, in the tension that had built until it could no longer be contained, in the small touches that spoke louder than confessions ever could. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of her hair brushing my neck, the steady rhythm of her pulse against my chest. My hand settled over hers, squeezing gently, and she lifted her face just enough for me to catch the curve of her lips in a brief, intimate smile. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was human, real, and that made it perfect. I never thought, she murmured, voice soft, almost shy, that it could feel like this. Safe, but alive. I tilted my head to meet hers, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I know, I whispered. I've never felt like this with anyone either. And I'm not letting it go. She chuckled softly, a warm, content sound that made my chest ache with a strange, exquisite lightness. Age, expectations, judgment, all of it seemed to dissolve in the quiet of that morning. The porch, the sunlight, the lingering scent of paint, even the small imperfections of the boards beneath us, they all felt like the perfect backdrop to a moment that was entirely ours. We didn't rush. We didn't need a grand declaration. Instead, she rested her forehead against mine, eyes closed, letting the intimacy of shared space and unspoken understanding fill the gaps that words could never reach. I mirrored her, leaning in, resting my cheek against hers, feeling her warmth seep into me. The world could wait. For once, there was only us. Time stretched in the gentle, comforting rhythm of intertwined hands and quiet breaths. Our fears had not vanished entirely, but they no longer held power over us. Hesitations, doubts, the age difference. They existed, yes, but they were shadows at the edge of the light we had chosen to step into together. And in that choice, we found a kind of peace, a sense of completeness neither of us had dared hope for. Finally, she shifted just enough to look at me, eyes soft but steady. I think we're going to be okay, she said. I smiled, pressing a quick, gentle kiss to her forehead, the simplest, truest kind of promise. Yeah, I murmured. We really are. And there we stayed, wrapped in warmth, in quiet intimacy, in the knowledge that what we had discovered together was real, messy, human, and entirely ours. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next? 25.